"Don't fill your plate. You didn't pay for this." Victoria's sneer cut through the Seattle restaurant. Aunt Margaret smiled. "Real family comes first, Harper." Anger wasn't loud. It was clinical. I didn't argue. I folded my napkin, walked to the lobby, and approached the concierge. This wasn't revenge. It was accounting. I calmly canceled my payment authorization on the master bill, leaving them to face an $18,500 invoice. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I'd love to know who's part of our community. I had been the silent investor in their version of family for 28 years. As a senior software engineer who had clawed her way up from nothing, my value to them was entirely transactional. I was the emergency fund, the quiet guarantor, the invisible architect of their comfortable lives. When Uncle Arthur's business hit a rough patch, I covered the shortfalls. When Aunt Margaret wanted to host extravagant holiday gatherings, I secretly financed them. And every single time, Victoria stepped up to take the credit, accepting the praises and the toasts while I sat at the edge of the table, footing the bill like a forgotten subscription service. It is a psychological trap, the cruel normalization of exploitation. When you consistently absorb the burden for people who view your resources as their birthright, they stop seeing your generosity as a gift. They begin to see it as a baseline requirement. Their cruelty isn't a lapse in judgment. It is a calculated feature of the ecosystem they have built around you. They normalize the abuse because it shields them from acknowledging their own inadequacies. By reducing me to a silent wallet, they elevated their own status without doing any of the actual labor. This particular anniversary dinner for Aunt Margaret and Uncle Arthur was meant to be a gesture of peace. I had agreed to cover a generous baseline budget, hoping to bridge the widening gap between us. Instead, it became a hostile takeover. Victoria hijacked the guest list, adding 20 of her own friends to what was supposed to be an intimate family gathering. She upgraded the menu to astronomical levels, swapping the standard wine pairings for vintage reserves and adding courses that I had explicitly not approved. She treated my bank account like an open ledger, confident that the established rules of our family dynamic would keep me in line. She assumed I would swallow the insult, pay the exorbitant cost, and fade into the background, just as I always had. But the rules of engagement had fundamentally shifted. I looked back through the glass doors of the dining room. I could see them laughing, raising their crystal glasses in a toast to family unity, completely oblivious to the financial reality about to crush them. They weren't just taking my money. They were taking my dignity and charging me for the privilege. I had spent my entire adult life trying to buy my way into their affection, believing that if I just provided enough, they would finally see my worth. I realize now that love for them was a contract, and I had been paying all the premiums while they reaped the dividends. I didn't feel sadness as I stood in that opulent lobby. I felt the chilling, precise clarity of a ledger balancing to zero. The investment was officially terminated. Let them try to cover the deficit with their illusions of superiority. The free ride was over, and the collection notice was about to arrive at their table. Through the heavy glass doors of the private dining room, I watched the execution of my decision unfold with mechanical precision. Daniel, the restaurant manager, approached the head of the table. His expression was a mask of professional neutrality as he placed the black leather folio directly beside Victoria's plate. She didn't even look up at first, her manicured hand casually flipping open the cover while she continued a loud, boasting conversation with cousin Julian. Julian, ever the weak-willed enabler, nodded along, completely detached from the reality of the situation. Then, Victoria's smug smile vanished. It was an instant, total system failure of her carefully constructed facade. She stared at the total, $18,500. Her eyes darted wildly, scanning the itemized list of vintage champagnes, imported caviars, and unauthorized upgrades she had gleefully ordered under the assumption that I would silently absorb the financial blow. For years, I had been bound by the invisible chain of the survivor. It is a psychological prison without bars. a state of learned helplessness where the victim is conditioned to believe that enduring abuse is the only way to maintain a connection. I had tolerated the humiliation because standing up for myself felt infinitely more dangerous than staying quiet. I had convinced myself that keeping the peace was an act of strength, when in reality, it was just survival programming designed by the very people exploiting me. But tonight, that programming had been overridden. Victoria's face flushed a mottled, ugly red. She shoved the folio toward Uncle Arthur. The color drained from his face as he registered the staggering number. He abruptly pushed his chair back, the legs scraping loudly against the polished floor, and stumbled out through the glass doors into the lobby. His breathing was heavy, his eyes wide with a mixture of panic and rising indignation as he locked onto me. "What have you done?" he demanded, his voice a harsh, desperate hiss. "What is the meaning of this? You told us this dinner was covered." He pointed a trembling finger toward the dining room, expecting me to cower, expecting the old Harper to frantically apologize and fix his problem. I looked at him, feeling absolutely nothing but cold, clinical detachment. I didn't shrink. I didn't offer a desperate explanation or seek his understanding. I stood perfectly still, my posture straight, analyzing him not as an uncle, but as a bad investment that I had finally divested from. I stopped paying for a party I was told I didn't contribute to. I said, my voice chillingly calm and even. The words hung in the air between us, heavy and final. "You authorized the budget," he sputtered, struggling to regain his authority. "I authorized a dinner," I corrected, my tone dropping to a flat, transactional register. "Victoria authorized an $18,500 extravaganza. I am simply letting the primary shareholder cover the costs of her own acquisitions." The panic in his eyes deepened as the undeniable logic of his situation settled in. The illusion of their wealth was crashing, and I was holding the sledgehammer. Uncle Arthur's retreat back into the dining room acted like a distress signal, dragging the entire toxic ecosystem out into the open. Aunt Margaret, Victoria, and Julian spilled out into the lobby, clustering around the Maître's podium like panicked shareholders at a bankruptcy hearing. The black leather folio sat in the center of the polished wood, a damning ledger of their entitlement. Victoria slammed her hand down next to it. "There has been a mistake," she snapped at Daniel, her voice shrill and commanding. "My cousin gave you her card earlier. You need to run it again. She's just confused about the authorization limits." Daniel did not flinch. His training in high-stakes hospitality made him immune to her manufactured outrage. "There is no mistake, madam," he stated clearly, his voice projecting across the lobby. The initial event contract was established solely in Miss Vance's name. However, the numerous upgrades and additions you personally requested throughout the evening were strictly denied by our system due to a complete lack of financial authorization on your part. Miss Vance has formally withdrawn her card from the master file. Victoria's mouth opened and closed. Her strategy had always relied on my silence, on my willingness to let her rewrite reality to suit her narrative. Stripped of that silence, she had no defense. "You can't do this," Aunt Margaret hissed, stepping toward me with venom in her eyes. "This is a family event. You are ruining our anniversary over a petty misunderstanding. You will fix this right now." She expected compliance. She expected the decades of conditioning to kick in. Instead, I met her gaze with an unblinking, analytical stare. "This isn't a misunderstanding," I replied mechanically. "It is an audit, and your accounts are severely overdrawn." Victoria attempted a frantic pivot, reaching into her designer clutch to initiate damage control. "Fine," she sneered, pulling out a gold credit card. "If she wants to be a cheap, vindictive brat, I'll put it on my card. We'll sort this out tomorrow." She handed the card to Daniel with a theatrical flourish, glancing around to ensure the nearby staff witnessed her taking control. But before Daniel could even process the card, the heavy oak doors of the restaurant's main entrance swung open. The ambient noise of the lobby instantly evaporated. Grandmother Eleanor stepped inside. At 82 years old, the founder of our family's tech empire still commanded a room with the gravitational pull of a black hole. Her posture was rigid, her expression carved from granite. She had been invited to the dinner but had intentionally arrived late, preferring to avoid the chaotic cocktail hour. She walked directly toward our panicked cluster, her sharp eyes taking in the folio, Victoria's extended credit card, and my unyielding stance. The shift in power was immediate and palpable. "Put your card away, Victoria," Grandmother Eleanor ordered, her voice slicing through the tension like a scalpel. "We both know it will decline before it even touches the terminal." The absolute certainty in her tone froze the entire family in place. The ultimate authority had arrived, and the final accounting was about to begin. Grandmother Eleanor did not raise her voice. She did not need to. Her presence alone was a verdict. She stood beside me, turning her piercing gaze onto Victoria, who was suddenly trembling, the gold credit card shaking between her manicured fingers. "I have been conducting a thorough review of the family's financial operations over the past 3 weeks," Grandmother Eleanor stated, her tone entirely transactional and brutally cold. "And I have uncovered a pattern of systemic fraud." Aunt Margaret gasped, clutching Uncle Arthur's arm. "Mother, please, what are you talking about? Victoria is just trying to pay the bill." "Victoria is trying to save face," Eleanor corrected sharply. She pulled a folded document from her handbag and dropped it onto the podium next to the folio. "Not only has Victoria been actively stealing credit for Harper's labor and financial contributions for years, but she has also monetized this very dinner. She covertly collected over $4,000 in cash contributions from our extended relatives, claiming it was to help cover the costs of a dinner that Harper was already funding in its entirety." The lobby descended into a suffocating silence. The revelation hit like a physical blow. Victoria hadn't just hijacked the event. She had orchestrated an active extortion scheme, pocketing thousands of dollars from unsuspecting family members while ensuring I carried the absolute maximum financial liability. Victoria's face drained of all color. That's a lie," she stammered, stepping back. "I was going to use that money for the tip, for expenses." "Process her card," Grandmother Eleanor commanded Daniel, completely ignoring Victoria's pathetic attempt at a defense. Daniel swiped the gold card through the terminal. A sharp beep echoed through the lobby. "Declined," he stated evenly. Victoria frantically shoved another card across the counter. Swipe. Beep. Declined. A third card. Swipe. Beep. Declined. The illusion of her power was disintegrating in real time. She was financially empty, operating on stolen capital and fraudulent status, but the audit was not yet complete. Grandmother Eleanor nodded to Daniel, who produced a printed email chain from behind the podium. "Furthermore," Eleanor continued, her voice devoid of any warmth, "Daniel was kind enough to forward me the correspondence regarding the event planning." Daniel cleared his throat and read aloud from the printout. "Per Victoria's explicit written instructions to the event staff, Miss Vance's name is to be removed from all anniversary cake plaques. Miss Vance is to be seated at the overflow table near the kitchen doors. Under no circumstances is the staff to acknowledge Miss Vance as the host or financial sponsor of the evening." It was a meticulously designed disappearance. She hadn't just wanted to exploit my resources. She had actively plotted my total erasure. It was a calculated, criminal twist that elevated her actions from mere selfishness to premeditated malice. Julian stared at his shoes. Aunt Margaret covered her mouth, her eyes wide with terror as the reality of her daughter's actions was laid bare before the matriarch. I looked at Victoria, analyzing the absolute ruin of her reputation. The leverage she had wielded over me was gone, replaced by undeniable, documented proof of her extortion. She had designed a trap to bury me, only to lock herself inside it. The fallout over the next month was predictable, methodical, and entirely pathetic. My phone became a repository for toxic text messages, desperate voicemails, and frantic smear campaigns orchestrated by Aunt Margaret. They tried to frame me as the villain, spinning wild narratives to any relative who would listen. I ignored all of it. Anger had been replaced by complete operational detachment. Then, precisely 32 days after the restaurant incident, Victoria bypassed building security and appeared in the glass-walled lobby of my engineering firm. She looked haggard, the artificial gloss of her superiority completely stripped away. She marched up to the reception desk where I was picking up a delivery, clutching a thin envelope. "I brought you a check," she announced, her voice lacking its usual commanding edge. "It's for the basic deposit, $2,000. Take it, tell grandmother the debt is settled, and call off this ridiculous vendetta." It was a pathetic attempt to buy back peace at a fraction of the market rate. I looked at the check she shoved toward my chest. I didn't reach for it. I simply stared at it, analyzing the desperate mechanics of her behavior. "I do not negotiate with fraudulent accounts," I stated, keeping my hands at my sides. "Take your check and leave the premises." Before she could escalate her demands, the elevator doors slid open behind me. Grandmother Eleanor stepped out, flanked by 2 corporate attorneys. She carried a thick, 23-page binder. "The debt is far from settled, Victoria," Eleanor said, her voice echoing in the minimalist lobby. She handed the heavy binder to her lead attorney. "This dossier documents decades of systematic financial exploitation, stolen credit, and unauthorized fund transfers. It outlines exactly how you, your parents, and your brother have operated a parasitic enterprise, funded entirely by Harper's labor. The rapid collapse of their status perfectly illustrated the illusion of power from an empty wallet. Their superiority was not rooted in character, intellect, or actual capability. It was merely a leased facade maintained by my capital. When you build your entire identity on resources you do not actually own, the moment those resources are cut off, you do not just lose your lifestyle, you lose your entire intrinsic value. Without my money buffering them from reality, their perceived power evaporated instantly, leaving them entirely defenseless against the consequences of their own actions. Eleanor delivered her final judgment with surgical precision. "As of this morning, I have officially stripped Arthur and Margaret of all financial control over the family trusts. Julian has been removed from the board of directors, and you, Victoria, are permanently banned from accessing, managing, or benefiting from any family accounts. You are entirely on your own." Victoria stared at her grandmother, her mouth trembling as the absolute finality of the power flip settled over her. The check in her hand fluttered to the lobby floor. She had come here expecting a negotiation. Instead, she had walked directly into the execution of her own financial exile. I looked down at the discarded check, feeling nothing but the clean, empty satisfaction of a ledger that had finally been balanced. 7 months later, a quiet, intentionally ordinary dinner was held at the exact same coastal resort. The menu was standard, the guest list was minimal, and the master bill was pre-authorized and fully paid. I arrived right on time, walking through the same heavy glass doors, but this time, the atmosphere was fundamentally altered. Victoria arrived shortly after, but she was unrecognizable from the woman who had demanded vintage champagne. Stripped of her golden child status and forced into financial independence, she looked genuinely humbled. She was in her 4th month of mandatory therapy and was adhering strictly to a court-ordered repayment plan. Aunt Margaret and Uncle Arthur sat quietly at the table, their arrogant posturing replaced by the subdued reality of their mandated psychological counseling. I hadn't accepted the invitation out of a lingering sense of familial obligation or a desperate desire to belong. I accepted because I held the absolute controlling interest in the relationship. The rules of engagement had been rewritten, and I was the one dictating the terms. Sitting at the table, watching them carefully monitor their behavior, I realized the profound liberation of letting go of bloodline to find oneself. For years, I had believed that walking away from family was an act of failure. But walking away from toxicity is not a failure. It is a vital act of self-preservation. True family is not defined by shared DNA. It is defined by mutual respect, dignity, and reciprocal care. Breaking the biological chain allowed me to reclaim my identity from a system that had only ever viewed me as a utility. I had shed the burden of their expectations and discovered the absolute strength of my own autonomy. The dinner proceeded politely, efficiently, and without a single moment of manufactured drama. There were no stolen credits, no hidden agendas, and no exorbitant, unauthorized charges. When the evening concluded, I walked out to my car, breathing in the cool, salted air of the Seattle coast. I've come to realize that the heaviest toll we pay in life is the cost of keeping the peace at the expense of our own truth. For 28 years, I had funded their delusions, believing that my silence was the currency required to buy their love. I was wrong. It was simply a subscription to my own erasure. Forgiveness isn't always for the other person. Sometimes it's the only way to set yourself free. But forgiveness does not require participation. You can forgive someone while permanently closing their account and revoking their access to your life. We hope this story gave you both drama and something meaningful to think about. This narrative was created to remind you that when someone takes your presence, your resources, and your labor for granted, your immediate and absolute absence may become the defining lesson they never expected to learn. But the real victory is not their regret, nor is it the sight of them stumbling through their own ruin. It is your freedom. True freedom begins the exact moment you stop letting others build their comfortable, fraudulent lives on the foundation of your silence.